Welcome, everyone. My name is Mastur Al-Kaboudi, the Canadian Accessibility Network Program Manager. On behalf of CAN and the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University, I would like to welcome you all to today's CAN Connect Forum, Accessibility Research Now and in the Future. We would like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the Carleton University campus and the CAN National Office here in Ottawa are located on the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And we are grateful to live and work in this beautiful territory. I'd also like to share a brief physical description of myself. I am a man in my 30s with brown curly hair and a light beard. I am currently wearing a button-up white shirt paired with a blue blazer and a sky blue tie speckled with white dots. I'm speaking to you from my office at the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University. We have a few housekeeping items to share with you before we start our panel discussion today. The Canadian Accessibility Network, CAN, is a national collaboration under the leadership of the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University. CAN aims to advance accessibility for persons with disabilities in Canada. While we endeavor to provide forward-facing supports in both official languages, the event today will be delivered primarily in English. However, captioning in both English and French and ASL interpretation will be available throughout the event so that you can follow along in your preferred language. Introducing our ASL interpreters is always a good reminder for myself and for our guests to try and speak at an even moderate pace so they can capture everything amazing that's being said. Any attendees who have indicated they required ASL when registering for this event have been given multi-pin privileges so that you can pin each of the ASL interpreters' videos. Pinning highlights their videos on your individual screen. We will be spotlighting our interpreters' videos throughout the event today as well, and we'll do our best to ensure the active interpreters are always on the screen. Captioning is available through Zoom. You can enable subtitles within Zoom by clicking on the up arrow next to the CC button at the bottom of your screen. You can also view subtitles via external links we will share in the chat. If you cannot see the captions or encounter any technical issues during the session, please put a comment in the chat and a member of our event support team will do our best to help you. For those joining via phone, you can use *6 to mute and mute and *9 to raise lower hand. And our last housekeeping note, for those who use screen reader or voiceover supports, we've been made aware that commentary and activity in the chat can be distracting and take away from our speakers. It is for this reason we have adjusted our chat settings today. You will only be able to chat directly with our event support team, who will be monitoring the chat and keeping an eye out for any questions or relevant comments. Thank you for understanding. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel moderator, Dr. Adrian Chan. Adrian is a professor with the Department of Systems and Computer Engineering at Carleton University. He is a biomedical engineering researcher with expertise in biomedical signal processing, biomedical image processing, non-invasive sensor systems, assistive devices, and accessibility. He is the director of the Graduate Program Collaborative Specialization in Accessibility and the director of the Abilities living laboratory. Over to you, Brian.
You mean Adrian?
Adrian, sorry.
Thank you so much there, Mastua. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to moderate this panel. So again, my name is Adrian Chan. My pronouns are he, him, his. I come to you from my office here at Carleton University. I am Chinese with black short hair, black rimmed glasses. Today I am wearing a short sleeve collared light blue shirt. Okay, so I've been at Carleton for now over 20 years and have been increasingly involved with accessibility in the disability community. And it's always been a pleasure. It's such a welcoming community, I find, that's working on very important issues. Accessibility research is continuing to evolve, and recently we've seen a great deal of attention and growth, which is both much needed and well-deserved for quite some time now. Today, we are exploring this field of accessibility research with the aim to understand the profound impact it could have on the day-to-day lives to persons with disabilities. Research is a powerful tool for removing barriers, and our work towards an inclusive and accessible society, both in Canada and worldwide, thereby enhancing the quality of life for everyone. Accessibility, it's an expansive area that benefits from diverse interdisciplinary collaborations. And so I'm thrilled to be joined today by an esteemed group of accessibility researchers and colleagues and friends who will share their insights and wisdom from their past and current projects, as well as discussing the future of accessibility research. For today's panel, we'll start off with some questions from me, but we will have an opportunity to take some questions from the audience as well. So to begin with, I'm going to invite our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And so I will call them upon one at a time. And we'll start with Dr. Boris Vukovic.
That's me. Thanks, Adrian. Boris Vukovic, middle-aged man, first-generation immigrant from Eastern Europe. My position here at the Accessibility Institute is director, which also serves as the National Office for the Canadian Accessibility Network. And I have a research faculty appointment with the School of Industrial Design. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Katie Ober.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie, and I am a mid-aged woman. My pronouns are she and her. I have shoulder-length dark hair with dark eyes, and I'm wearing an olive green jacket and white shirt with a black tie, and pearl earrings today, and some lipstick, red lipstick. And I'm joining you from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. I am a settler of Eastern European and Scottish descent, and I work at St. Francis Xavier University, which is located in the town of Antigonish in rural northeastern Nova Scotia. I teach in the Department of Sociology, and I also hold a Canada Research Chair in Health Equity and Social Justice. As part of this work, I serve as a director of the Spatializing Care Intersectional Disability Studies Lab, and we're really excited to be launching a new center on aging and disability justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, Dr. Claire Davies.
Hello, I'm an associate professor of mechanical and materials engineering at Queen's University. I am a middle-aged blonde cis woman with the pronouns she and her. I have blue eyes and I'm wearing a navy blue V-neck sweater. I'm speaking from my home in Kingston, Ontario. I am the director of the Building and Designing Assistive Technology Lab, so the BDAT lab. And my work revolves around increasing independence for persons with disabilities by designing various forms of assistive technology. So effectively, I am seeking to leverage academic resources to meet the assistive technology needs of the community. My research is primarily focused on computer access through a variety of different means, and that includes eye tracking, brain-computer interfacing, switch access. So I'm doing everything I can to assure that equity is achieved as much as possible.
Thank you, Claire. And then our last panelist, Dr. Mahadeo Sakai.
Hello, everybody. Good morning if you're east of Manitoba. Good afternoon if you're west of Ontario. My name is Mahadeo Sakai. I am a brown-skinned man in cisgender, so my pronouns are he and him. I have very thick glasses on. Currently have a buzz cut, which I just did a couple of weeks ago. I am wearing a bright orange shirt with a black tie. I'm not sure if the patterning on the tie will actually come through in the video, but the patterning is gold and silver stars with white centers. I'm coming to you also from my home in Kingston, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat and Anishinaabe and Huron-Wendat peoples. I am a first-generation settler coming to this land from what is now the Caribbean. In my role, I am the Vice President, Research and International Affairs and the Chief Accessibility Officer of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, or CNIB. I run CNIB's nationwide research program, which has two basic foci, one of which is understanding systemic barriers and biases experienced by persons with lived experience with disability in participating in society. And those barriers could be organizational, or they could be individual. We are also focused on quality of life and lived experience of persons who are blind, deafblind, and have low vision. I'm very pleased to be with you today and to chat with you about accessibility research and the role that I play in accessibility research in Canada.
Thank you so much. What an amazing introduction, and hopefully everyone here understands how great it is to have such a wonderful panel and expertise that's going to be shared with us today. So let me begin with our first question and our discussions by looking at where we are presently with accessibility research. And so for my first question, I'm going to ask each of you to discuss a project that you are currently working on or recently completed that exemplifies the current state of accessibility research. And Claire, I'm going to call upon you to kick us off here.
All right, it's such a hard discussion because you never know which one to choose, right? I could discuss a whole bunch of different projects. So right now I'm going to talk about augmentative and alternative communication strategies for persons with speech impairment. So this is known as AAC for short, just because that's a mouthful to actually continue with. And so what we've been doing is we've been working with individuals who have speech impairment in identifying what the barriers are that exist for them. And so there's a relatively large proportion of the population, about 400,000 people in Canada that do have speech impairment. And this makes it difficult for them to socialize and achieve equity within, especially the employment community. So one of the things we have done most recently is looked towards understanding what are the barriers within AAC as a means of communication. So we started off with data collection from qualitative interviews in what's called a Delphi study. And a Delphi study is a study that has a series of rounds where we try to evaluate what is most important. And so from the first round, we identify a variety of questions. The next round, we actually did a couple of surveys and each round we eliminate the number of questions and eliminate the things that are of most importance until we get to those that are really the most critical that need to be addressed importantly across a large variety of people. So the important thing is to keep asking questions over and over again until we actually come to the root of what's important. So we started off by interviewing 36 individuals who, first of all, who rely on AAC as their primary means of communication. We talked to caregivers of individuals, we talked to their teachers, we talked to therapists and manufacturers. So we tried to get a representative population of persons who are in that community of persons with speech impairment. And so when we actually did these interviews, we found a variety of different themes that caused barriers. And those included funding, the social environment, ableism, and the societal attitudes, as well as access to different supports. Or were they able to access those supports? And so that was our first step. And during that time, another thing we did is we looked at the overview of systems that currently exist. And we were identifying barriers that in obtaining AAC communication technology. And so here we found that there were barriers, including geography. Were you in a rural setting? Were you in a urban setting? It made a huge difference. And then when you're in a rural setting, do you have access to internet? And so I'm assuming most of you here have access to internet. But that is one of the uphill battles that people have when they're actually seeking technology to enable them to speak more clearly. And so we found that they had difficulties as well with access to applications. So even if you had a computer and you could download the applications, were they at a reading level that you could actually understand? And so these were some of the major barriers that we found with respect to gaining access to assistive technology that enables a person with speech impairment. So another thing we did concurrently is looked at employment of persons with speech impairment. And again, we did 10 qualitative interviews with people who relied on augmentative communication methods to communicate with us during these interviews. And we often found that people were treated like a child. It was as though they were cognitively impaired just because they couldn't speak. And so people would talk to them as though they were just a 3-year-old. Even though a lot of them are often highly educated, the people we talked to often had master's and PhD degrees, yet they couldn't find employment. And one of the biggest problems here is that there's a disconnect between the funding available and the employment that's available and what is required of the job. And so a person who with speech impairment may be able to operate 90% of the job as typically as everybody else, but they just can't communicate with their peers. And so we can rely on Zoom, for example, and hand raising that enables those people to show what they need to show by raising their hand, and then nobody interrupts them. So one of the biggest problems about meetings within a meeting environment is people interrupt them. And so being on a Zoom session allows more clarity and allows them to actually have their voices heard. So these are a few of the things that we found specifically with employment of persons with speech impairment. Another thing that we also found is that a lot of these individuals are also on Canadian disability benefits. And as soon as they get employment, there's a limit to the amount of money that they're allowed to make. So there's these trade-offs. If you make too much money, one, you're making too much money, but the other thing is you lose a lot of your benefits, and the benefits are linked to the amount of money you make. So there's a whole lot of different things that are and that applies universally across Canada with respect to all disabilities, not just those with speech impairments. So we're trying to identify the problems and we're suggesting solutions, and now we just need to see them implemented as we move forward.
Thank you, Claire. I mean, it really speaks to the multiple layers, I think, when we think about accessibility research here. Maybe I'll turn it to Boris to go next here.
Thanks, Adrian. Well, speaking of layers, my point is, in terms of the current state, is about interdisciplinarity. So I couldn't pick one project. I know the question is in the singular project. Sorry, apologies. So I will refer to a few different projects to illustrate that point, that the current state of accessibility research is highly interdisciplinary, which is amazing. That's what's so exciting about this emerging field. So with the Accessibility Institute, for example, and I'm picking and choosing here, there's a bunch. We are just embarking on a project that is going to look at accessibility of proactive and reactive emergency management standards. So let's say we're talking about evacuation from a train or at an airport, and how accessible those procedures are. And we know that people will react very differently to some of those standard procedures in terms of sounds and sights and emergency personnel approaching people and directing people and so on, right? So that's going to be very, very interesting, bringing together, so far we have co-PIs from U of T in geography, York in disaster and emergency management, Ottawa U, cognitive accessibility, and Accessibility Institute. Another one that's again very different is about accessible housing through an autism lens. It's in partnership with the Sineev Family Foundation, looking at how to make housing more accessible to neurodivergent Canadians, and having discussions with communities and stakeholders on this issue. And obviously, there's a big housing strategy. We are part of a very large project that is looking at the housing strategy, a safe and affordable place to call home. So this is a more particular lens on neuro-inclusivity in housing. Then we completed a project on the standards for acoustics in the built environment. That was really interesting. I'm sure many of you have observed or had very different experiences in terms of how accessible a space is when it comes to acoustics. So we have produced a draft for the acoustic standards for the Accessibility Standards Canada, which was the funder for that project. We also are across Ontario have engaged a group of institutions, post-secondary institutions, to look at implementing a model to prepare students with disabilities for employment after they graduate from colleges and universities. We are calling this the David C. Only Initiative in recognition of David C. Only. And it's building on a previous project that we did where the model was developed. So we have career services, disability services, and other stakeholders at post-secondary institutions working together to prepare students for employment. And the last one I'll bring up is a project on developing an AI prototype for disability services in post-secondary education. Again, highly interdisciplinary project that includes engineers, occupational therapists, disability studies scholars, and people from education and psychology. We are hoping that this is something that can be valuable, and I'll come back to that particular one because I do want to put a spotlight on AI in terms of accessibility research. So I will save that for one of the later questions. All right, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm hearing things about how accessibility is important in various aspects of our lives, how technology and how it emerges. Being an engineer, love technology, of course, but how it can play a role in how accessibility research continues along as well. And finally, I'm hearing about the diversity within the disability community as well. As I'm listening, I'm nodding along. Katie, I'm also seeing that you're nodding along as well in agreement with too many things. So maybe I'll turn it to you to speak.
Okay, thank you, Adrian, and thank you so much, Claire and Boris. I'm just such a huge admirer of your work, as well as the work of others on the call here, Adrian and Mahadio. It's just a privilege to be in such good company, and to have the opportunity actually to collaborate with many of you on a number of projects. So the work that we do at the Spatializing Care Lab focuses on policy-oriented and policy-focused participatory action research that is community-driven and community-partnered. It's informed by a sociological approach, but we do try to adopt that interdisciplinary or aspire towards a transdisciplinary perspective, which Boris has mentioned. And so I would like to focus, though, on one particular project that we recently completed. And this isn't research as it is conventionally understood. It was research to advance a review of Nova Scotia's Accessibility Act. So this legislative review was something that was mandated by the Act itself, required. And we were really just thrilled at the Spatializing Care Lab to be able to lead this work. So science, we know, plays an important role in supporting equitable and inclusive social and public policy development and reform related to accessibility. And the review of the Act, I think, was innovative in its approach and also in the team. The review involved research on the legislation and consultations with nearly 800 Nova Scotians. And so our research team was comprised almost completely, over 2/3, of first voice disability and accessibility policy researchers and subject matter experts. And so I think that's something that's really important, and we're starting to see more of the inclusion and leadership of people with lived experience within accessibility research, and not only as participants. So this project examined the effectiveness of the Act and the work that was completed on accessibility standards over the first 4 years in Nova Scotia. And it involved an assessment of progress that was made under Access by Design 2030. And that really is just the government's strategy or roadmap for achieving the goal of an accessible Nova Scotia by the year 2030. So we looked at all of the activities that were undertaken in those first 4 years, and we considered issues related to priorities, human and financial resources, consultation, and timelines. And as part of that work, we connected with people who identified as deaf, neurodivergent, and people with disabilities. We connected with representatives from organizations representing people with disabilities, as well as organizations affected by the implementation of accessibility standards. And then members, staff, and employees of the Accessibility Directorate, which was a body that was created to administer the Act, And then the Provincial Accessibility Advisory Board and Standard Development Committees, as well as a number of other folks that were involved in accessibility work and advising across the province. And we use multiple methods, so virtual and in-person meetings and interviews, surveys and focus groups, and community town hall sessions. I think another innovation is really, adopting that multi-sectoral approach that involves engagement with diverse people and communities and multiple perspectives. And so we adopted an intersectional equity approach. And what this means is that we view disability as interwoven with other forms of marginalization related to immigration, for example, but also structures such as racism, colonialism, poverty, ageism, sexism, homophobia, and xenophobia. And then just to kind of wrap up, I'll share some key findings, and there is a report that's posted online. But it was important for us to recognize that accessibility and inclusion are not the same thing. And so through this work and engaging with people from multiple perspectives and positions, we learned about the harms related to attitudinal barriers, how they were often long-lasting and resulting in isolation. These attitudinal barriers impacted participation and enjoyment of people in all areas of their lives. And so that was really important to kind of think about in relation with accessibility. And it also became very clear that just having accessibility standards or rules or regulations doesn't guarantee accessibility. People need to know that they exist, interpret them in the ways that realize the intentions behind them, and have the resources to be able to do so. And that it's really important in all of this to understand accessibility from a systems perspective, because it doesn't occur in a vacuum. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Mahadeo, maybe I'll give you a chance to talk about some of the projects that you're either currently or recently working on.
Thanks very much, Adrian. So Katie mentioned intersectional equity, and I think, first of all, thank you, Katie, for mentioning it, because it sets the stage quite well for some of the things that I want to talk about. So as I said, we have two sort of major areas of focus in CNIB research. One of them is this focus on systemic barriers and biases. And so this is where we get to ask questions that are related to, for example, how do we do inclusive employment, and questions around, how do we do inclusive access to healthcare, right? And those questions can get asked in sort of a funded way, in air quotes, where we actually have money to do the work. And there's also questions that we ask because, we don't have the money. We're not going to take the time to find the money. And what we are going to do is figure out how to do the project. So I want to highlight a couple from each of those spaces for you, because sometimes there's a level of urgency to the work that we have on our plates that we have to do. It takes between a year and 2 years to actually secure grant funding to do research, and accessibility research is a little bit finicky in this space because not everybody funds accessibility research, not everybody understands it, which is a bit of a barrier to the doing of the work. And so in the funded projects I'll highlight, we've done work funded by Accessibility Standards Canada on universal design in the workplace, the work environment, not the physical space. We've done work also funded by ASC on guide dog access barriers in Canada. We've done work that's just wrapped up on building a model to do accessible procurement. We have also just wrapped a project on responsible conduct of research through an accessibility and inclusion lens. We have a project active on accessibility and inclusion competencies in the workplace. When we talk about workplace inclusion, workplace accessibility, we almost always focus it on the conversation between the worker with a disability and the employer. And we don't talk about the coworkers, we don't talk about the colleagues, we don't talk about the direct reports, we don't talk about the managers. And it's sometimes their remits to be aware of accessibility considerations, and many times it's actually not their remits to be aware of accessibility considerations. But then that sets up this perspective, particularly if the accessibility support in the workplace is an obvious one, like large dual monitors, for example, or flexible hours. This accessibility support that's provided to the worker with a disability becomes known to everybody else, and then how is that managed? Because we don't really teach accessibility competencies in the workplace. So I listed off all of those projects, and I will tell you that for 4 of them, the academic literature is actually very poor, if not non-existent, which gets us into one of the interesting things about accessibility research, which is that often people don't actually ask the questions that we're interested in asking, or if they're asking the questions, they're asking them, and I'm just going to say this very bluntly, wrong. It's not through an appropriately anti-ableist lens, or sometimes you actually learn more about what people aren't asking than you actually learn about what they are asking when you're reviewing the literature. So that's the procurement project and the RCR project are especially fascinating to me, because they suggest the need to create whole systems around how to do things that we haven't necessarily conceived of. The notion of going shopping in the workplace, buying things, procuring things, to use the technical term for it, through a lens of, there are workers on my team who might live with disabilities, and I may not be aware of this, but I'm still going to think about what those lived experiences might be like, creates an element of empathy and compassion in how we do things in policy that isn't necessarily something that we've thought about. Same thing for the responsible conduct of research piece. We did an audit of research ethics applications, and the vast majority of them don't conceive of research through a lens of inclusion of persons with disabilities. This is how we have, research that's done in accessible survey platforms, how we have consent forms that are not prepared in plain language, how all sorts of barriers, great and tiny or seemingly tiny, exist for the disability community in inclusion in research. The other type of project that we do is the type that we didn't fund because there isn't time to go find the funding, because we need to do this. And the one that we have active right now is in partnership with the Ottawa Heart Institute and the Department of Health Sciences at Carleton University, where we're actually looking at the accessibility of blood pressure monitoring devices within the disability community. And this conversation, we started it through a lens of, vision loss and blindness and low vision. And the first place that people went to in their minds was, what's the causative relationship between blindness and hypertension? And my response to that is, it's irrelevant, because one can live with vision loss and one can live with hypertension. One can live with vision loss and one can have had a stroke. There doesn't have to be a causative relationship for us to be interested in the work that we're doing. And in fact, sometimes that notion of a causative relationship links what really ought to be considered in many persons' lives, a lived experience, a demographic, in an unfortunate way to a health outcome, right? And we have this tension between, is disability a demographic and is disability a health outcome? And the answer is, it is one thing for one group of people. It is one thing for a different group of people. It's both for a third group of people, but we have to be aware of that nuance. The last thing I'll touch on before I pass it back to Adrian is a methodology piece. So we started post-pandemic to run these annual things called co-design festivals, where we bring the disability community together on a number of these projects, and we pose questions for co-design, thinking about, what does an accessible blood pressure monitor look and feel like, right? What should competencies in the workplace look and feel like, right? If we're going to do research, how should research be done through a lens of accessibility and inclusion? So we get to ask those questions in a co-design manner, and use that to really build a community and build an engagement network that we and collaborators have really taken advantage of building and having and nurturing, I think, because what it allows us to do is really bring the disability community into the research space in a way that hasn't really been thought about. I have one foot in the health sciences and ophthalmology space, and the way that crowd talks about accessibility in research is so very different. It's mental whiplash sometimes, but it's still, we know we're on the right track when people realize that they're doing it, as I said in the beginning, wrong. The co-design festivals we've only been able to do in Toronto so far. Would actually love to consider doing one in say an Ottawa region. Hint, hint, Adrian. Hint, hint, Boris. But that's for later. And they've worked really well in Toronto, and to my knowledge, nobody else has really done them. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll come to other things later.
Thank you so much. It sounds like we're going to have another idea to implement here in Ottawa. Thank you, everyone, for such a fulsome explanation of some of the things that you're involved with. And I know that you're still even being selected with what projects that you've been doing as well. A lot been going on. But that answers to the first question gives us a nice foundation to give people an idea of like the variety of research that's been going on. And so my next question, and Nadia was sort of alluded to some of the challenges that we encounter when we engage in accessibility research. He nicely put it as finicky funding as an example. And so perhaps I'm going to ask each of you to highlight one challenge that you experienced with accessibility research and how you've been able to address it in your work, including with public engagement. So Boris, maybe I'll get you to start off here.
Sounds good. Yeah, funding is definitely one. I think each one of us will bring that up. So I then thought maybe I can focus on what I call the othering and marginalizing, which is about this perception that some parts of the research and scientific community may have about accessibility as being about practice and services and relevant to only a small segment of the population. So it's either not of interest, or a researcher may even be doing work that's relevant to accessibility, but may not be able to see it as relevant to accessibility. And again, this is not about researchers deciding to have this kind of attitude or perception. It's simply not being familiar with accessibility and or certain, I guess, historical assumptions about what accessibility is. And as far as how we go about addressing these challenges, well, panels like this one, I think, is one powerful way to counter those perceptions, because you see the incredible diversity of research that happens in the accessibility space, and how, like I said, it's interdisciplinary and cutting edge, and it's future facing as well. Those are all those kind of things that excite researchers or research funding agencies. But there is that issue of funding, right? So if we could, the more we promote this view of accessibility as an exciting, cutting edge, future facing, interdisciplinary field with the Tri-Agency of Canada, for example, the more it, the word accessibility or persons with disabilities or disability will be included in those funding calls and at the tables of the committees that make decisions about these programs. And lastly, I think we'll come back to this one too, as far as the benefits for the society at large. Earlier I mentioned that there is a perception that this is relevant to only a segment of the population. And I know we talk about this a lot, especially in the context of universal design, that there are benefits for the across our society. That is still that still persists as a view of accessibility that we need to change, and have the funding agency and researchers see the benefits for all.
Katie, maybe I'll call upon you to continue this.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I agree with funding, absolutely. And Boris, I also heard you say, ensuring that we have champions that are located within the research ecosystem, people who are working in accessibility, people who bring technical expertise as well as lived expertise, and people who are diversely located. Since, as Claire mentioned, whether someone's in a rural environment or an urban environment can really change a lot. So all of these relate to what I see as the biggest challenge right now, aside from funding in accessibility research, and that is implementation science. And this relates to what Mahadio was talking about in terms of the quality of the evidence that exists, or maybe the accessibility of the evidence. I mean, it's incredibly exciting to be like at the, I would dare I say, vanguard of like, we're in the midst of societal transformation. Like there's no getting around it. We have legislation that is encouraging directions, but we're already moving. And we need to have access to strong science. So implementation science is important, and I think it's a current gap, and that impacts all accessibility research. So we really have to kind of speed up in some ways to address this gap. And I know that many of the projects already discussed here are doing this work, but there is a lot of work to be done. And so implementation science may be best understood as the scientific study of strategies and methods used to support the uptake of evidence. So not only the evidence, but how will the evidence be taken up in everyday practice and regular use in multiple different settings. And so, it's so important for us to develop new knowledge, new practices. I tend to work in the service area, so I also think services are important, but agree that there can be assumptions about what accessibility research is, or what the spheres of accessibility work are that limit our imaginations sometimes. But I don't know that we really know a lot about the structures and conditions that shape whether we even perceive these, these products and this new knowledge and information as relevant, how we'll use it, what are the conditions of success. So again, want to emphasize that systems perspective and think about what do we need to know in order to be able to move beyond plans and visions and products towards intentional change. Thanks.
That's fantastic. Mahadeo, maybe I'll let you continue the conversation here. Oh, sorry, Mahadeo, your microphone is on mute.
Of course, yes. There we go. Absolutely agree with everything that Boris and Katie have just said. So I'm gonna offer an answer here by starting with a very brief story. Early last month, I was giving a presentation, also virtually, to a different space, and I was talking about the work that my team does and the work that we're planning on doing over the next decades in terms of understanding quality of life and lived experience within the blind, deaf, blind, low vision community. And I had a researcher, a scientist on that meeting raise their hand virtually and say something to the effect of, why did you choose to do this work yourself? Because most nonprofits give money to academics to do this kind of work. Why are you doing it? In other words, why am I taking money away from hardworking academics who need money? My response to that question was very arrogant. It was, I can do it better than you. But it's also actually very sadly true, because so CNIB Research is a team that is comprised of researchers with lived experience. It's led by a researcher with lived experience. We do, and Katie's heard this definition before because it came up in a meeting that she and I were at together. We do disability focused research, which is research for, by, and with persons with lived experience. And when I took over CNIB Research and I asked the question, who was doing work like that, the answer was very few people. And the answer today is very few people. And in fact, a substantial concentration of the very few people are sitting right here on this panel. And I don't say that to make nice and curry favor. I say that because it's actually true. So one of the major barriers is this perception of who actually does this research, and this notion that any research, particularly accessibility research, can be driven, can be led by, can be physically done by, and intellectually done by people who are actually not in academia. It just boggles the mind of some folks. And then I think Boris mentioned this as well. The issue of accessibility as practice, accessibility as tactics. The larger conversation around inclusion is a very strategic conversation within the organizational space. The larger conversation around accessibility is very tactical in the organizational space. And I say that wearing the hat of Chief Accessibility Officer as well as the hat as Vice President of Research, because I've witnessed it, I've experienced it. It's this really interesting thing. Give us a checklist and things will be accessible. And so the notion of doing research into the underlying premises behind ableism and behind anti-ableism and behind accessibility and disability focused work, just it doesn't make sense if people are thinking, well, just give me a checklist. The last barrier that I think is important to raise, as researchers, we live within a space where many of our fellow researchers are basically of the opinion that if it is not published in an academic journal, it never happened. And that sounds very crass, but it is also very true. The thing is that there are tons of people within the disability service provision space who don't have the time or the energy or the wherewithal to write academic papers. And so there's lots of practice that goes on where it's actually not, it's not thought about, it's not looked at through the implementation science lens, it's not interpreted, it's not presented in a way that academics will necessarily parse, and therefore a conversation will happen where some researcher in some North American institution will say, well, this has never been done before, when in reality it's actually never been published. And that I think that chasm between those who practice and those who think about practice, which is one way to contemplate what research is a chasm that my team certainly tried to close because of our location, with varying degrees of success depending on who we've talked to. But it certainly is one of those really, really interesting barriers that exists within the space.
Thank you. Claire, do you have something small to add there?
I'm just looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, I wouldn't be able to organize all my thoughts around this because there's so many people have contributed so many important comments about this particular question. And so, yeah, I agree with everyone. One of the things that one of my students says is talkies sure like their meetings. And that's one of the things is accessibility is yes, it should be met by talking and presentations like this. But as Mahadio said, it's not just in academic journals that we have to publish this information. It has to be more overreaching and allow everybody within the community access, because even when you do academic journals, they're not necessarily going to be cited a million times, because accessibility is not one of those things gets cited over and over again. So within that space, we as researchers in academia are not recognized for the research we do because it's not cited a million times. And so I think that's one of the things, one of the barriers from our perspective. But I have to agree, co-design, lived experience research, all that implementation science, being able to create an equitable environment, those are all fantastic things that we have to move forward with. And I'll leave it there because I know we're short on time.
Yes, I'm going to see if we can get to our last two questions. There's lots of information to be shared here. And so I do want to also get to some questions from the audience. Simultaneously, appreciate that we also need to keep our speaking pace good for our ASL interpreters as well, who are doing a fabulous job. So our next question here is looking at one major emerging opportunity in accessibility research that could revolutionize inclusivity, design, accessibility. So now we're looking a bit into the future. And so Katie, maybe I'll let you start us off here.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. This one's easy. I was so happy to have this question, the lead on this question. Advocacy. So some research that I do right now has been on disability advocacy within post-secondary settings. So understanding the importance of disabled students groups in advancing more equitable and inclusive education. And so this is work that is informed by a partnership with Eviance, incorporated as Canadian Disability Centre on Disability Studies, informed definitely by the Canadian Accessibility Network, CAN, and also informed by the National Educational Association of Disabled Students, NEEDS, who are really leaders in making this a reality. So that advocacy piece as a focus of research is exciting, because you can then contribute to that, but also advocacy by researchers that are working in the field of disability and accessibility. And so, you know, advocacy is increasingly expected of scientists or researchers, and that is so revolutionary. How we mobilize research in ways that can also mobilize diverse disability communities, I think, can really advance inclusivity and design in ways that we haven't yet imagined. One risk, though, that comes, and as a sociologist, I'm always interested in what are the potential unintended consequences. A risk is that the most privileged people with disabilities, or the most privileged accessibility researchers and allies, will benefit the most from changes that are happening and from advocacy, and often people already in the system. So within the context of research, people doing research within often university settings or perhaps hospital-based settings where they can hold positions and hold funding. And there is a certain privilege, status, and prestige that I do really think needs to be questioned. And thank Mahadio for his work in that space. So we see lots of changes in the research ecosystem that have been catalyzed by Canada's Accessibility Act at the federal level and by provincial laws in provinces where they exist. And often there is a disability rights perspective. And so these changes that are happening in research align with that disability rights perspective, which really focuses on equal opportunities and protections under the law. And we know that Similar laws and policies have been in place in the United States since at least 1999, with the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, where optimism, though, and about the revolutionary potential of the act has been tempered by unfulfilled promises and continued social, economic, and cultural devaluation, exclusion, and exploitation of multiply marginalized people and communities. And so these are people and communities lacking representation or deprived of resources needed to navigate and benefit from legal processes and systems. And so this is addressed in the United States by the Disability Justice Framework and movement led by disabled activists, Patricia Byrne, co-founder of Disability Justice Arts and Performance Project Sins Invalid, Mia Mingus, Stacy Milburn, and others. And here, across movement solidarity, culture making, and community building is centered. And so I think in our work around advocacy, whether we're studying it or doing it, we really need to go beyond what's being required or proposed by recent legislation and think with a justice perspective. Thank you.
That's very powerful there, Katie. Thank you. Claire.
Right, I think that is great. And I think that one of the important things about the advocacy is also the invitation of inviting persons with lived experience to be involved. And that has been brought up by Mahadio as well. And then along those lines, effective compensation for those people who do participate in this research. One of the biggest issues is how do we pay people and how do we enable them to contribute effectively? So I think one of the biggest things is that concept of participatory research that includes all members of the community in the design of the projects, designing the research questions, ensuring that we implement the research correctly, and ensuring that we understand and interpret the research correctly. And so, interestingly enough, one of my most recent grant proposals, as part of the initial expressions of interest stages, is you have to identify a budget for that first part, is having a workshop with all the participants and in developing the questions around that. And so then you have that workshop, and from there produce a full grant proposal based on those experiences of everyone. And so I think if that we could move towards that sort of concept, is including people from the very beginning and moving forward with inclusion and interpretation of the lived experience. I think that's one of the best ways that we have to move forward.
It's very much in line with what Mahadeo was saying about asking the right questions as well. And so Mahadeo, maybe I'll turn it to you to continue this.
Well, so I think Claire and Adrian, you touched on something. If we don't ask, we, the community of researchers, if we don't ask the right question in the right way, then we're always going to get the wrong answer. And so I recall a conversation with an engineering student from a school that I will not name, not represented by anyone on the panel, don't worry, who came to me and said that they discovered that if you shocked the cheek of somebody wearing a blindfold, there'll be a piezoelectric flash in behind the eyelid of the side of the face that you shock the cheek on. And so wouldn't this be a great navigation tool for blind people? The number of things wrong with that coming out of the mouth of a PhD student in engineering, I could not begin to count. And I told them as such. The kicker was that this thing had actually received research ethics approval from their home institution, which just drove me up a wall. I did not understand how that could happen. And I say this because the number of people who do accessibility research who do not have a connection to the disability community far outweighs the number of people who do accessibility research who are of the disability community or who have a first degree connection to the disability community. And if that's the case, and that's forever going to be the case, there's two ways to deal with that. One way is to cultivate the next generation of researchers with disabilities, which I think is a conversation hopefully that we'll have time for. But the other way of doing it is to change the hearts and minds of the next generation of researchers, period. So it's not just about recruiting people into accessibility research, but it's also teaching the next generation of trainees how to ask those questions with not just sympathy or empathy, but also with compassion, how to ask those questions in a meaningful way that connects with and reinforces the relationship with the lived experience up front, right, as opposed to an afterthought. And so when we do that, and my team, we take about 50 students a year, and we take a lot of efforts to work with those students to make sure that we're changing their hearts and minds. And I always talk to the incoming students and say, if you're not willing to learn and you're not willing to change your perspective, you're going to be miserable for however long you're here. You're going to be miserable, so don't bother coming. And on the one hand, that's a bit of a very different interview style, but it also works because students are aware that they're coming to learn a new way of doing things, or what is for them a new way of doing things, what is for us really the best way to do it, with meaningful results for the disability community. And that I think is the greatest opportunity, because if we all started teaching that way, and we're all cultivating what the next generation is taking up about how to do accessibility and disability focused research, then we'll see much more positive improvement. We'll have many fewer questions asked the wrong way, or the wrong question being asked.
Boris, if you want to close off this question for us.
Sure. I'm hearing a lot of arguments that speak to this emerging opportunity being the disruptive role that accessibility research can have and is having already, in terms of how research has been historically done. We're talking about participatory co-design, so not just approaching communities as participants, but as experts. Claire brought up compensation. That's a big one. I mean, we are in some ways ashamed that research has and still in some areas uses your $25 gift card as compensation for what is tremendous lived experience expertise that should be treated equally as any other expertise in terms of disciplinary expertise. We're talking about I think in the chat there's a comment about academic research. I think this is true of again, traditionally research has been performative rather than focused on substantive action. We are in accessibility research always thinking about that impact and what is it going to do. And maybe that is part because accessibility, one side of accessibility is about making change and addressing those gaps, which is a good thing, which is what drives us to engage in very applied and impactful research. So all of that to me sounds very disruptive to how research is conceived, still is conceived among many researchers in many fields.
Thank you. And I do appreciate that comment that I saw in the chat from Nancy Hansen, who is a wonderful researcher and has been a long time advocate and very impactful with their work as well. All right, with our last questions, I do want to get to some questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to try my best to limit folks to just a quick 30-second response to this last question, which is, Imadu, you already alluded to this, but the next generation of researchers. And so as we look to nurture this next generation of researchers and practitioners in accessibility, what is one essential advice would you offer to them to make a meaningful impact in this field?
This time I remember to unmute. So it's a great question, Adrian. I think that the advice that I would offer is that to do this research really requires a strong degree of empathy and a strong degree of compassion. And what you identify that might be a barrier might actually not be a barrier if you talk it through with someone, and there might be a different barrier entirely that's worth time and attention. And so particularly if you're a researcher who doesn't have a lived experience, ask first. And when you ask, also make sure you're thinking about what the answer is. And if you are a researcher with lived experience, our lived experiences don't mean that everyone has our own lived experiences. And so we run afoul of the opposite danger, which is assuming too much. And that's also a bit of a danger. And so the one piece of advice I think I would offer, everybody is never assume.
Boris, I saw that you just took a sip of drink, so I'm going to ask you to continue on.
Sounds good. Well, okay, a 30-second response. Think beyond your discipline is the note I wrote for myself. I really think accessibility is one of these pretty rare fields that can aspire to be transdisciplinary. It's a concept that goes back decades, and very few fields manage to do that, which requires to completely overcome one's disciplinary knowledge, research methods, and objectives, and come together in a kind of new space and create things that really transcend disciplines. I think accessibility is one such emerging field, and I think that's a huge opportunity. So to all the emerging researchers, think beyond your discipline.
Katie?
Thank you. So I just wanted to echo what Mahadio said and share another term that would add to, I think, Nancy's comment on ableism, and that's internalized ableism. So, you know, you could be a person with lived experience, and my experience is you're still making sense of your experience. Our experiences change and shift and grow as we learn, and so it's complex. And this relates to what Boris said as well about transdisciplinary work, insofar as, like, we really need to suspend what we know and challenge it. Like we need new frames of reference and systems of relevancy. And then when that work is intentional, we can really start to kind of do our work in different ways, then be more open to the full range of and diversity of experiences, which is critical to accessibility. So those are my quick comments, but my comment about what I think is so important is related to, you know, we have to do our homework. It doesn't matter. We have to, like, where it is, you have to learn about disability histories in plural, communities in plural, and cultures in plural. That's absolutely critical. And we need to build relationships with people and communities, and this takes times. We need to build and hold space for generosity with others and with ourselves. And I think it's really important that people know that you will do and say the wrong things. And it's not because of a personal or moral failing. It's an expression of the diversity of disability and the reality that accessibility issues occur within complex human adaptive systems. So let's be generous, but we also need to be accountable. Thanks.
And Claire, you had the first word in these rounds of questions, so I'll give you the last.
All right. Well, I had all those things written down as well: being truly empathetic, ensuring interdisciplinarity, reinforce the relationship with persons with lived experience. And as a summary, I'd call it building better together. And that happens to be a course that I teach in which we have engineers and occupational therapists working in teams with a client from the community. And it's trying to train those people being the engineers and the occupational therapists, to work with members from the community and people with lived experience from the time that they are in that really flexible stage of learning, such that they do engage with persons with disabilities or stakeholders right from the very beginning. And so, yeah, my key term is building better together. That's what we have to move forward.
Thank you. So much information and wisdom being shared here. And so I do want to give an opportunity to hopefully get some questions from the audience. So Lester, do you have any instructions for people of how to pose questions?
Yes, Adrian. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, now it's time to post your questions to our panelists. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat, and I will or Adrian will read them to our panelists. If you require ASL interpretation to ask a question or share a comment, please raise your hand and we will spotlight your video and invite you to sign your question. For any attendees who are joining us over the phone, the controls you can use to interact with us during the Q&A are *9 to raise and lower hand, *6 to mute and unmute yourselves. So we are looking out for questions, and then we will share them with Adrian. I do have a question. Adrian, I just sent it to you.
Okay. So the question here is, how may an activist researcher with learned or lived experiences who are not affiliated with institutions become involved in research projects? And again, this goes to this question about, being outside of the formal academic structure. How does one participate in research here? For our panelists, if you want to jump in here, maybe I'll let one or two of you respond if you want to raise your hand. Claire?
Reach out to us, reach out to the community of academics. I think that's the best way to do it. There are a lot of people, we all have our own profiles on the university's webpage. The number of people who have either phoned me or have contacted me through other means to participate in research and to suggest questions is remarkable, and I love it, and we include everybody within the Building to Better Together projects. So yeah, it is definitely something that I would recommend. Just reach out.
Mahadeo, I'll let you respond as well, and then I'll move on to our next question.
Yeah, so I'm going to echo Claire. I think it's important to reach out, but if you don't feel comfortable reaching out, also know that those of us who do this work also reach out. And so every so often, from time to time, we will publish a call for participation in A, B, or C, right? And sometimes what will end up happening is we'll note the same people keep saying yes, and sometimes that's geographically restricted. Like I'm fairly certain that within the Ottawa community or within the Kingston community or the Antigonish community or the Toronto community, you're always going to find the same group of people who are going to say yes to various things over and over again. We've seen it with the co-design festivals, and through that, we've actually created this sort of co-research community with some of our collaborators and those folks who are activists, researchers who are, I think the traditional term would be citizen scholars, with lived experience, right? Who are interested in engaging. So if those calls are going out, you're also able to pay attention to them. But if not, I think Claire's right. If you reach out to any of us from wherever you might be, fairly certain we know people who we can connect you with if we can't engage you directly.
Okay, our next question, and Katie, I think I'm going to get you to start off with this one because it touches a bit on implementation science. One of the challenges in accessibility research is that it's often restricted. journals are behind paywalls, making it inaccessible to professionals in the field. Are there centralized resources where people can access accessibility research, and how can we get this research more readily accessible for non-researchers? Like, the insights in this research can be very valuable, but if they're not widely circulated, then they're not uptaken, as you said.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I don't think currently there is one hub that has all, that's really truly fully representative. But I think they're being built, and I would turn to Canadian Accessibility Network, really as collecting, doing, partnering, leading, partnering, engaging, and mobilizing quite a diversity of projects that are happening across the country. I think that there's a real shift. I know that there's a shift that's occurring right now, where there is an emphasis on knowledge mobilization and knowledge sharing. So, I would really look to CAN and perhaps pass the torch to Boris. But I would suggest that there needs to also be advocacy from community to say that we want these things. I think we've got lots of different hubs that occur locally. And that's important to have access to local knowledge and local projects, especially when we're looking at accessibility from an implementation science perspective. We want to, we test things and have pilot projects and then want to scale them and spread them without always knowing, whether the conditions are right for success or how they may need to be adapted. So I think if there was advocacy from community, and the biggest thing that we learned from the review that we conducted on Nova Scotia's Accessibility Act was the power of the media. So whether you're a researcher or you're someone in community, you have access to the media to say, what do you want? You can tell your representatives, but you could also kind of engage community more broadly and publicly. Thank you.
And Boris, I was going to call on you as well, but Katie did as well. So maybe you can add something about CAN and the Accessibility Institute.
Sure, yeah. I did post something in the chat, or Mastur is posting a link. But in terms of CAN, we were talking about creating I guess a directory or a roster of accessibility subject matter expertise, where we can feature people's profiles and expertise. And that's just one way of addressing this challenge of making such expertise visible publicly, accessible, so people who are interested in collaborating can easily engage and find people. And people like somebody from the audience who asked how to engage can join and be included in such a roster and be featured as a person who has expertise, including, of course, lived experience expertise in accessibility. So we are definitely working on that through CAN.
All right, I'm going to try to take two questions and put them together, and maybe Mahade, I'm going to get you to start with this last question here, which is it starts off with the Academy not being of a social justice mindset. How do we navigate that tension between advancing the justice movement and dialogue within the Academy? Someone posed it in another kind of way, which is, how do we get people to expect disability as a natural part of the academic landscape?
That's a great question. So I also chair the International Network of Visually Impaired Researchers and their allies, also abbreviated INOVA, which was something that we founded during the pandemic as a way to start having some of those conversations, and that's a sort of continental, because it's for the most part North American, collective of researchers who live with vision loss, who are in not necessarily any specific set of fields. I think at this point it's a lot of different disciplines, but all of them are in the social and health sciences space for the most part. So the way to address this recognition, I think, and Nancy made a comment about this before. So the academy is very ableist, and in fact, research and science as constructs, the way we think about them in Western society, it's very ableist. You have to have certain abilities to do these things, and if you don't have these abilities, you can't do these things. And that is a textbook definition of ableism. The challenge with that mindset is it also comes from a space of a closed loop of there's only certain ways you can do something, and if you don't do things in those certain ways, then you can't do things, right? And that's a root challenge, and you know, one way of really addressing that is to start as a community of researchers with lived experience, actually start pushing back a little bit, and also recognizing that translational research almost by definition is social justice research. So translational research very broadly is research intended to create social benefit out of something small, right? And the thing is, one can't have social benefit without also having social justice. If one's going to be truly inclusive and truly equitable about the world that we live in, then social benefit is social justice. There isn't a separation between those two things. And so translational research, the way that all of us on this call will apply translational research, because none of us are doing the bench to bedside thing, right? The way that we're all applying translational research is that translational research by definition is social justice research. How do we get others to think the same way we do? By continuing to have panels like these, by continuing to have conversations like these, by continuing to train the next generation. I'm very fond of saying that sometimes the best thing to do is to write off the current generation and focus on the next generation of researchers and trainees. And if that's the group that's going to enact a sea change because this group is too old and too set in its ways, then that's the group to enact a sea change. No offense to anyone who's going to internalize that and say I'm calling them old and set in their ways. But you know, my sense is that what we're talking about is generational changes. We're not going to change the system overnight. I've been spending goodness knows how long trying to, you know, convince people that research and STEM can be accessible to persons with lived experience, and it's an ongoing conversation. But the more of us who take up the conversation around the embedding of social justice principles in the academy and understanding that that's what translational research is, the more it will penetrate, particularly to that next generation. Thank you. And we definitely need to continue this conversation. We're running out of time. This conversation has been very rich, so I'm going to turn it off to Mastur to wrap us up here.
Thank you, Adrian. This has been great. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions. On behalf of the Accessibility Institute and the CAN National Office here at Carleton, I would like to give a big thanks to you all and to our moderator, Dr. Adrian Chan, and in particular to our amazing panelists for being open and sharing during this great conversation. Your ideas got us really thinking about knowledge mobilization, research impact, and making a real change. We will be sharing a link to our feedback form in the chat. We ask that you all please take a moment to fill it out to help us keep developing and improving these events. If you have any questions or want more information about getting involved in CAN, please don't hesitate to contact our national office at can@carleton.ca. We'll share this email address in the chat as well. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our amazing panelists for this conversation, and which we definitely need to continue further. And thank you, everyone. And thank you to our event support and our accessibility services. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.